Welcome back to the God Script. This is episode 4. Today's explainer tackles a massive, foundational question. What are people for? We're going to look at how 5 major world religions define human purpose, and, crucially, why it matters so much who actually gets to decide. Okay, so let's dive right into this. Every single political system on Earth rests on a prior claim. Before any constitution was ever drafted, before the first parliament was ever assembled, and long before any modern theory of human rights was even formulated, someone had to answer a truly fundamental question. It's a question that no legal document can actually answer on its own. It's this deep philosophical question that sits quietly beneath every single law you obey and every single right you claim. And that question is simply this: what are human beings fundamentally for?
The answer to that question? Well, it determines absolutely everything that follows. It decides who deserves dignity, who gets power, and who can be sacrificed in the name of some higher purpose. It dictates exactly who has rights that no government can ever remove and who has obligations that no government can ever excuse. So, every political system operating in the modern world has the theology of the human at its very foundation, whether it admits it or not. In this explainer, we're going to excavate that foundation, going tradition by tradition, to show you exactly where each answer leads.
But before we let any specific tradition speak, we need a diagnostic tool, a way to measure this. And for that, we turn to Plato's Republic. Written way back around 375 BCE, it gives us a brilliant foundational framework. Plato essentially divides the human soul into 3 distinct parts. First, you have appetite, which is our desire, our bodily needs, our economic drive. Then you have spirit, which is about honor, courage, and the will to take action. And finally, you have reason, the capacity to understand reality exactly as it is and to govern the rest of the self accordingly.
To help us visualize this, Plato gives us this absolutely iconic analogy of a chariot. Imagine, if you will, a chariot being pulled by 2 incredibly powerful horses. One horse represents appetite, the other represents spirit. Now, holding the reins is the charioteer. That's reason. The chariot goes wherever reason steers it, utilizing the raw, incredible power of both horses. But, and this is the key, when the horses overpower the charioteer, the whole chariot crashes. Plato argues that justice requires reason to govern spirit, which in turn governs appetite. Now, every single tradition we are about to look at has its own unique version of this architecture. Each one decides which part of the human being is most real, most valuable, and most in need of cultivation. And that decision, it produces a very specific political theory. So, let's apply this frame.
Section 1. Image bearers and fallen creatures. We begin right at the Abrahamic fault line, stepping into the Jewish and Christian answers to the question of human purpose. Now, these traditions start from a shared origin point, but as you'll see, they arrive at vastly different political consequences. The foundational claim of Jewish anthropology is found right in Genesis 1:27. God created humanity in his image. The Hebrew phrase for this is tselem Elohim. Now, it's really important to get this. This is not a claim about physical resemblance, not at all. It is a claim about ontological status, meaning what a human being fundamentally is at their absolute core. In the ancient world, where literally only kings were thought to bear the image of the gods, this was a shockingly radical idea. To understand this today, imagine a country that stamps its national seal on every single citizen's passport. That seal doesn't describe what the person looks like or even how good of a person they are. It declares whose authority they are under and what protections they carry. Tselem Elohim is exactly that seal. It is stamped on every human being at the very moment of creation, before they've taken a single action. And crucially, it cannot be revoked by any human authority, because, well, no human authority put it there in the first place.
But the image bearer in Judaism is also a covenant partner. The Torah presents God entering into these binding agreements with humanity. So the human being here isn't just a passive recipient of dignity, they are a highly active partner. And this brilliantly illustrates our Plato frame. Judaism absolutely privileges reason, but a very specific kind, moral reasoning that is responsive to divine command. The 613 commandments of the Torah act as the terms of this partnership agreement. They aren't just arbitrary rules imposed from the outside by a dictator, they are obligations accepted voluntarily to order human appetite. The charioteer reads the Torah, and the horses are ordered accordingly. The political consequence here is immense. Think about it. A tradition that grounds human dignity in the literal image of God cannot ultimately justify the total dehumanization of any group. Why? Because the authority always answers to the God whose image that human bears.
Now, Christianity inherits this Jewish claim in Tselem Elohim, but it adds a major dimension that changes the entire picture: the fall and the concept of original sin. To explain this paradox, I want you to imagine a classical masterwork painting. Let's say it was created perfectly, it bears the artist's signature, and it is completely irreplaceable in its value. But then, imagine that painting gets damaged. It's cracked, it's discolored, it's distorted.
Now, the original image is still there. The signature is still perfectly legible, but the painting simply cannot restore itself. It requires an outside expert restore. In Christian theology, the human being after the fall is exactly that cracked painting, genuinely damaged, incapable of self-repair, and desperately requiring the expert restore, which is divine grace. Human purpose here isn't merely about earthly flourishing. It is fundamentally about participation in the restoration of that image.
So the really crucial point is how this exact paradox maps politically. It gives us two wildly different applications. On one side, the image-bearer claim produced the theological foundation for universal human rights, the bold declaration that every single person has inherent, undeniable dignity. But on the flip side, the fallen creature claim has historically been used to justify authoritarian paternalism. Because if humans are like that damaged painting, if the charioteer is fundamentally broken and appetite has already triumphed over reason, then humans simply cannot be trusted to freely govern themselves. They need strict external governance by those who've already received grace. Both of these massive opposing political architectures flow straight from the exact same theological source.
Section 2. The Trusted Steward.
Let's move over to Islam's theology, which actually offers one of the most optimistic views of the human within the entire Abrahamic tradition. Here, human purpose begins not with a desperate need for rescue, but with profound, weighty responsibility. In Islamic theology, every single human being is born in a state of fitra. There is no inherited corruption here, no original sin. Think of fitra as a clean, entirely blank notebook. It's not a corrupted computer file that's glitching from day one. The notebook can absolutely be written on badly by a toxic environment or by poor personal choices, but it begins perfectly clean. And then, there is the amana, which is the divine trust. The Quran states that God offered this immense moral trust to the heavens, the earth, and the mountains, and they all refused it. They were terrified of its weight. Imagine a head of state offering the management of a vast, unbelievably complex institution to every single branch of government, and they all decline. Probably because of the sheer amount of paperwork, right? But one single department steps up. That department is humanity. Because we accepted the amana, the human being is the most uniquely accountable creature in existence.
Now, Islam's answer to our Plato frame is explicitly structured. The tradition clearly outlines 3 stages of the soul, or the nafs. First is the nafs al-anharama. This is the soul totally dominated by appetite. Basically, the charioteer is losing the battle. Next is the nafs al-lawama, which is the self-reproaching soul, the conscience. This maps to spirit, where the charioteer is struggling, fighting for control. And finally, you have the nafs al-mutmaina. This is the soul at rest, completely governed by reason that is responsive to God. Here, the charioteer is in full, calm command. The goal of human life is to complete this exact journey. Politically, what does this mean? It means the state's job is simply to create the optimal conditions for individuals to fulfill their amanah. The state doesn't save souls. Its job is just to support the charioteer.
Section 3. The Soul and the Wheel. Now we're going to shift registers entirely as we look at Hinduism. This tradition presents a highly complex, multi-layered theology of the human that operates simultaneously on the cosmic, the social, and the individual levels. Honestly, the most radical anthropological claim in this entire explainer is Aham Brahmasmi, I am Brahman. In the Advaita Vedanta tradition, the Atman, which is the individual soul, is actually identical with Brahman, the ultimate reality. Consider this analogy to wrap your head around it. Imagine a single wave on the surface of the ocean that suddenly realizes it is not separate from the ocean at all. It is literally the ocean, just taking a temporary, specific form. The wave has always been the ocean. In this view, the human ego is merely the illusion, or maya, of separation. Human purpose here is to dissolve that illusion and finally recognize what was always fundamentally true.
But this incredibly sophisticated philosophy also gives us dharma, the cosmic order. Think of dharma a bit like a massive symphony orchestra. A violin and a percussion instrument have entirely different roles, right? Both are absolutely essential to the music, but trying to perform the percussion role on a violin violates that instrument's dharma. When applied socially, this produces the Varna system, which actually maps directly onto Plato's chariot. Brahmins, the priests, are reason. Kshatriyas, the warriors, are spirit. And Vaishyas and Shudras, the merchants and servants, are appetite. So both Plato and Hindu social theology arrive at the exact same structural conclusion. But there is a critical difference here. Plato allows for movement based on a person's capacity. The Varna tradition, historically, fixes your chariot assignment entirely at birth.
The mechanism locking this all together is karma. Think of karma as a cosmic ledger that carries forward across lifetimes.
Every single action writes in that ledger, and your next rebirth perfectly reflects the balance. Now, the political consequence of this is profound, and we have to look at it impartially. From a critical standpoint, this ledger justifies present suffering as entirely self-caused. It can make a socially produced hierarchy appear to be an individual's own cosmic moral responsibility. Now, it is vital to note that internal critics, like the Bhakti movement and much later Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, have fiercely challenged this institutionalized hierarchy from directly within Hindu thought. They've argued forcefully for a much more egalitarian interpretation of human worth, showing that this tradition is dynamic and constantly wrestling with its own implications.
Section 4. The river with no self.
Now, Buddhism emerges with a subversive answer that basically dismantles the entire framework we've been using. It outright denies that there is a permanent human self to even have a theology about in the first place. This is the profound concept of anatta, or no self. Let's use an analogy here. Think of a rushing river. The water that was in that river yesterday, it's gone. New water is there today, and an entirely new water will be there tomorrow. The river has a name, it has a character. It has a direction, but it has no permanent, unchanging water that makes it the exact same substance across time. The human being is that river. What we call the self is actually just a floating collection of physical and mental aggregates. So, if there is no permanent self, human purpose isn't about saving a soul. The goal is to clear the rocks of craving and delusion from the riverbed. Because when the rocks are removed, the stream flows peacefully. You aren't trying to save the river, you are simply trying to cease the turbulence.
And this brilliantly illustrates a radically disruptive political consequence. Think about it. If there is no permanent self, then every single system of privilege and exclusion based on who you supposedly permanently are is built on a massive philosophical error. Under this view, caste is groundless. Race is groundless. The Buddha actively accepted students from every background, boldly declaring that a person's worth is built strictly by their actions, not by their birth. This was a directly political claim against hierarchy back then, and it remains an incredibly potent one today.
Section 5. The network and the synthesis.
Finally, we look through an African philosophical lens, specifically the concept of Ubuntu and the thought of philosopher John M. Beatty, to find a distinct, genuinely sixth answer to our core question. In this tradition, the human being is not some isolated individual on a private journey toward personal salvation or liberation. No, the human being is a node in a network, deeply connected backward to the ancestors and forward to the unborn. Think of a massive server network, with glowing fiber optic cables connecting every single computer to every other point in the system. The server doesn't exist just to send one private email. It exists to maintain the integrity of the whole web. You are one of those network nodes. Your purpose is to remain connected so the network continues to function. If you fail your obligations, a cable literally goes dead. Therefore, human purpose isn't just for God alone, or for escaping a cosmic cycle. It is for the community. The whole community, spanning completely across the boundary of death itself. Purpose here is intensely, fundamentally relational.
So let's bring this all together and see how this builds back into our Plato's chariot framework. Every tradition we've discussed has decided exactly how the chariot is steered. In Judaism, the charioteer reads the Torah, ordering the horses with inherent divine dignity. In Christianity, the charioteer is damaged by the fall, desperately requiring external grace to steer it all. In Islam, the charioteer accepted a massive divine trust and is held strictly accountable. In Hinduism, the charioteer was assigned a specific chariot at birth and must fulfill that exact cosmic role. In Buddhism, well, there is no charioteer at all, only the flowing river, and the goal is just to clear the rocks. And in the African lens of Ubuntu, there is no isolated chariot on a solo journey, only the road, which is maintained by everyone together.
So, the absolute crucial takeaway here is this. Every theology of the human is a political theory. You can't separate them. The tradition that says humans are divine image bearers cannot conceptually justify slavery. The tradition that says humans are fundamentally broken creatures has historically justified paternalism. The tradition that assigns your soul a rank at birth has locked people into vast hierarchies. What you believe a person fundamentally is dictates exactly how you will treat them in the public square.
Whoever answers the question of what people are for controls the architecture of every political system that follows. So who gets to decide? And perhaps more terrifyingly, what happens to those who disagree with the answer? Every tradition decides what humans are for. But what happens when a tradition decides that a person has fundamentally failed that purpose? That is the profound, dangerous line between good and evil. And we are going to explore exactly what happens when that line is crossed in our next explainer. See you then.